So, Joe, Uppercase print, what did you think?
There was a season on at the BFI a few years ago on the New Romanian Cinema, and one of the films I saw there was it was a documentary called The Autobiography of Nicolae Ceausescu, and it was quite clever and quite funny because it was a long film, it was about 3 hours long, and the whole thing was comprised of state-approved footage. So it was Ceausescu amidst adoring crowds and all these parades and playing badminton and streets lined with people waving the flag and all the rest of it. And so if you didn't know how that story ends, if you didn't know that he and his wife would be tied up on film, arrested, convicted, and shot by the people, you'd think that Romania was a very happy place to be in the 70s and 80s. And so that was a really interesting film. And it seemed to me that Uppercase Print, which comes like, I think about 5 years after that film, sort of borrows that strategy because it seems to parallel, it goes back and forth between a very precise representation of this one case against a young boy who writes some graffiti on the walls and is arrested by the Secretariat, against it intercuts that story with all this footage of kind of like anodyne or celebratory footage of just a regular country, people beating the mats on the roofs and driving around and people in hospital, just like to paint the portrait of a regular, relatively happy country this sort of pop cultural footage completely elides all of the oppression that is actually really going on. So in some sense, it seemed to me from the very get-go that it wasn't entirely original, but it's quite an effective technique, nonetheless. Even if it's not entirely original, it's still quite effective to go from this very precise story of effectively like state oppression and autocracy, and to intercut that with, the official picture, which is everything's fine. I quite liked the central conceit, the way it deconstructed that trial, and it clearly, I'm pretty sure it was then a real case, and so they've got all this evidence, they've sifted through it and represented it and had people kind of reading the transcripts to camera in order to piece it back together. And the precise deadpan delivery, all of that, I think serves the material really well because it really brings out the absurdity and obsessiveness of the state police. And when it talks about how they removed the fence panels that had the graffiti on it for forensics and stuff. And it's absurd and bizarre and, kind of hilarious and frightening at the same time, which I think is entirely appropriate for that kind of context and what was going on in the country at that time. And so there was a lot to enjoy. My problem with it was I wasn't sure by the end that it really, the concept was strong enough to sustain a 2-hour film. I found after an hour or so, I started to get a bit bored with it. And this structure, this back and forth, started to feel a bit schematic. I think the fact that I was surprised that the whole story was just this one case. I thought there would be a number of cases, but it wasn't. It was just this one case of the boy, and his crime, as it were, was, as I say, to write graffiti with chalk. And it would have been, I get the feeling that this boy's story was supposed to be emblematic of something much broader, of, the oppression and the small acts of heroism and the compromises and the complicity and all those kind of complex emotions that go with a country under, constant state surveillance. But that story never quite elevated itself into that level of significance. And so as a result, it felt kind of too small. There were nonetheless lots of really nice touches throughout. I liked the way there's a scene towards the end where the guys are at a table and they're kind of explaining their rationale for the arrest and the interrogations and stuff. And you can see members of the crew and you can see some of the lighting rig. And at one point, one of the guys who's talking, he's got this shawl over his shoulders and there's a light behind him, and he's sort of looks like a magi or something. There's touches like that that are really quite creative and surprising. And so although I didn't find the film wholly compelling, it's always helpful to me helpful for me to look at formally ambitious and experimental work, because even if I'm not entirely absorbed by the story, I'm always kind of stimulated by experimental stuff. And there was one point where it was towards the end, and he was arguing, the character of the boy was arguing with his father, and he was being shot like in profile, fairly close, and as throughout the whole film, delivering his lines really deadpan. And there was something really absorbing and striking just about this composition and the deadpan delivery and the stark lighting and the way they'd kind of gotten these written transcripts and put them in actors' mouths, but they were really inexpressive. So there was something about the conceit there that was suddenly really stimulating and interesting, just as an experiment. But as a story, it didn't entirely work for me.
I have major problems with this film. I realized I had seen one of his previous films. I think it was on Mubi. It wasn't the one you referred to. It was I Do Not Care If We Go Down in History as Barbarians. And it's a similar, it's a similar genre, let's say, to what you described that other film and this film is, because this film was like, it was a film about a group of people creating a reenactment of the Odessa massacre in 1941, I think. And it was quite interesting. It was long. It was too long. It was 2 hours. It was over 2 hours. I think it was 2 hours 20 minutes. But I remember being kind of interested in it because it was creative and original. I think we can say that. I agree with you that this guy is trying to do something original, and it kind of worked, because in the same way, some as happened in this film, sometimes you could see the crew making the film, and in fact it started out so I like that kind of Brechtian thing of not of not hiding that it's actually at some level pretense, which is always interesting, I think. And actually one of the things I really remember about that film is that the main actress in the story, who's kind of in charge of making the reenactment, she actually introduces herself at the beginning and says what character she's going to put, in the film. It's not like before the film, and says what character she's going to play. So there's this kind of, takes you out of the film for a little bit, and I like that, and I like the way in this film, in Uppercase print, as in that other film, the Barbarians one, that it's kind of a bit partly documentary. I mean, clearly there's things that are factually true in the film, and he uses a documentary style, but then there are things that are not documentary, or that are a reenactment or a theatrical production. So I think he's interesting in what he's trying to do, but maybe there is a little bit of repetition. Maybe he's doing the same thing, repeatedly. It did, when I watched that other film, I just looked back at some very short notes which I made after I saw it, and it did, because it was dealing with this massacre where people were hung, and they reenacted, or they put bodies kind of hung in the main square, and it was quite there was an interesting element to that I think the onlookers weren't quite sure what it was, and so whether it was they did it as a real reenactment in the film, but so the onlookers thought it was a reenactment, not just a film. And it raised questions of kind of the presentation of traumatic history in art, and it does evoke the questions raised by Adorno, that whether, I mean, Adorno said that after Auschwitz to write a poem is barbaric, and there's a whole debate about how to interpret that, but the way that I interpret that is that art can't ignore, art can't just be about making beautiful things and making nice things. The art can't ignore the tragedies, the massacres, the terrible things that have happened in life. If art works, it has to work, given all of the horrible things that have happened in the world. I don't think it means that for me, I don't think it means that all poetry, all art needs to be, pessimistic and downbeat and negative, because actually I think, it's a really interesting challenge to find beauty, even if you kind of work from a place where those terrible things have happened in history. So, I think that's the challenge for the artist today. I think, history and kind of social awareness and cultural awareness have definitely changed the way, artists need to work. I think I kind of totally accept that. And I think that he is really influenced by that, and his films, at least the two I've seen, very much are kind of taking Romania's history and doing something interesting and creative with it. Well, I say interesting, I did find this film incredibly boring at times, but I appreciate that he is trying to do something something creative and interesting. I thought that the two sides of the film, the kind of random, it seemed almost random archive footage, but actually I think that that was quite well curated. It is a curated collection of clips, and I thought that they actually worked quite well in themselves. I was a bit less convinced than you about the kind of theatrical presentation, the play, I guess. I mean, I did think it was very striking. What did impress me was when you had that aerial view of the set in advance, the colors were very striking, and the images that when it did, as you say, the actors, although their presentation was very deadpan, the aesthetics of the play were the colors were beautiful. Somehow the images were very high resolution. They looked very real, and I don't know technically how you do that, whether that is filming at a high level of frames per minute, or because it just looked, especially compared to the old footage, it looked so clean and so pristine and aesthetically very interesting. Each of those sets I thought were very powerful images, and you'd get the face at the front and the color and the various props behind. I actually thought that worked quite well. What I was really unconvinced about the way these two things work together. I think it becomes, I don't know, if this film was 15 minutes long and it did, and it kind of contrasted the two things, it may have worked for me, but I felt it was so repetitive. As you say, you think, you would think that there might be more than one story, but it was the same thing again and again, the same facts, the same, it was never giving us anything new. So for me, it became really boring. And, I think this guy knows what he's doing. So, there has to be a reason why he made the film in that way. I don't think he did that by mistake. I respect him enough to know that there must be a reason why he did it. I just, on this viewing, I just failed to see it. For me, it really didn't work. I think the politics are so clunky in it. You know, it reminded me of Ai Weiwei's work. You know, he's a really interesting artist, obviously making work in a similar way about Chinese history. And, you know, I think I guess it's a personal preference that for me, I want there to be some subtlety in the politics in a film. You know, if you're putting politics into a feature film, if it's not a documentary, I want there to be some subtlety. I think if you just kind of make the politics very obvious, and that is the main purpose of the film, you know, there's something missing. It's, for me, film is not, unless you're making a documentary, I want to see more subtlety in the way politics is used in artwork. I do think the Adorno idea of writing, of making art after Auschwitz is, you know, I do think it's important, but I think that's the challenge for the artist. You still need poetry, you still need creativity, and you know, I just think this really didn't work. You know, I think any particular Ai Weiwei work is really interesting, but you know, a few years ago, the big Weiwei exhibition at the Royal Academy, you know, it's just room after room of the same point being made again and again in this quite clever work. You know, any individual room, if you were just to see it in isolation, you know, he's a clever artist, but it's like just making the same point again and again. And I guess what that brings you to is that if you live in one of those societies and, you know, you've lived through it, or your parents have lived through it, and you've suffered oppression, you know, maybe that's enough. The work does work for you. So maybe for a Romanian audience, this film really works. But you know, I'm privileged. I haven't had that experience, and so, you know, it lost something for me. I can appreciate maybe what it's trying to do. What I did think was that, actually, I mean, I don't want to remake someone's work, but you know, I've talked about this a bit in a few of the reviews about whether a work would be better shown in a gallery than in a cinema. And actually, I think that this could work really well in a gallery. And I imagined an installation where you would have two screens at either end of a room with overlapping sound, where you would have all the images on one screen, and you would have all the play, the theater of the, you know, the story of this boy playing out on the other screen, so that you could always hear the kind of idyllic fantasy propaganda stuff when you're hearing the, you know, the details of the case. And I just thought in some ways that as an installation in a gallery, that you didn't necessarily have to sit there for over 2 hours, that you would walk in and out of, and you could get the point within 5 or 10 minutes of watching it. So, you know, I do think there's something really interesting in his work, but I just really struggled to enjoy this film, and I did find it very boring and tedious at times. I think that the energy changed in the last, I was quite pleasantly surprised, in kind of the last 20, 30 minutes, the energy changed in the film, because there was a scene where the camera was down in the kind of theater scenes, and it panned round various of the scenes, and it had never done this before. The camera was very static. As you said, the actors were very deadpan. The scenes from the play were very still, and usually just one person speaking to the camera. And if there was a conversation, they were fixed. You know, as you talked about the conversation between the son and the dad, they were fixed, you know, on the right and left of the screen with the scenery behind. We had this panning shot around various of the scenes. And I found this incredibly exciting because I'd been so bored in the film that then this visually was really interesting, because I think these scenes aesthetically were quite stunning and striking, and it settled in what was either a courtroom or, you know, a hearing at the school, or where there were multiple characters and they kept turning around and speaking, and they were speaking much quicker. It was less deadpan, and so the energy completely changed, and it kind of, I just found that really refreshing. It did kind of pull me in, and there were other scenes, like, as you say, that scene where they're rationalizing what they did, which was, you know, obviously very evocative of the Last Supper. And yeah, the light around his head and the cloak, you know, it was kind of like definitely a Jesus image for me. And all the food on the table, you know, and I don't really know what that means in the overall scheme of things, but I enjoyed, you know, the questions and the ambiguity around that's a lot less obvious than most of this film. So, you know, actually that there were bits towards the end that actually pulled me back in, and I'm really glad that I kept watching it, because actually I could have stopped watching this film, you know, halfway through. I very rarely do that. The last film I did that with, the only film I've done that with in the last few years was Jojo Rabbit. I really did not like that film, and I stopped watching it after an hour. I keep meaning to go back and watch the rest of it, because I do think I need to make sure I've given it every chance. But I would have walked out of this film, I think, in a cinema. I'm actually glad that I stayed to the end, because I think his work deserves, you know, to be watched. But for me, it failed. It was a bold attempt, but for me, it just failed.
Oh, shame. I would imagine a few things occurred to me when we were talking. I would imagine the reason it's as repetitive as it is, I suppose, is to reinforce the maniacally repetitive nature of the interrogations, and, you know, the sort of slow, wearying, emotional state one might experience when you live with that stuff year after year after year after year. So as a conceit, I respect it, and I think it's well thought out.
But that, you see, to make you sit in a cinema and watch that for more than 2 hours, I think that's asking too much of your viewer. I think you could walk in and out of this. That's why, if it was an installation, you don't need to have 2 hours of that. You know, if it was an installation and it just caught your interest and you stayed with it for half an hour, you'd start to get that repetition. But it just seems like a mistake to me to require but, you know, maybe there's a point in that, because, you know, if you lived in Romania, you didn't have any choice. You were required to behave in a certain way. So maybe there's something about kind of, he wants you to be captive for 2 hours sitting in the cinema, not you know, finding it very repetitive and restrained and repressed. But yeah, I think that's a lot to ask for people. But I take your point that actually that is probably the reason why he did it.
Yeah. And I think there's potentially something quite interesting, actually, in the perversity of that, in making someone sit there and listen to it, you know. And, you know, as you said, this idea about you prefer sort of more subtle politics. I think on the whole, I agree. As you said there, we do have the luxury of being able to step in and out of that kind of engagement with politics, and I think there's something to be said for setting that luxury aside for a moment, and, you know, really giving yourself over to what it might be like to experience, you know, a cultural milieu in which that isn't really a choice, you know, and perhaps that's what the film is doing. I have a feeling that this kind of analysis of it is probably making it seem as though I enjoyed it more than I did, because on the whole, I too found it quite boring overall. I think your point sort of tangential point about how one engages with violence and history in film is interesting. It made me think of The Painted Bird, that recent one. It's also on Mubi. We're not planning to review it. I have seen it, and I'm not going to watch it again, because I think that's a really good example of, you know, if terrible events have happened in the world, now how do you make art? How do you make art that seems to somehow incorporate those things and doesn't ignore them? And I think The Painted Bird is a good example of how not to do that. And how you don't do that is depict really grueling, gruesome events, but frame them in such a way that they look beautiful. You know, I think that's a really kind of morally dubious, borderline reprehensible treatment of history, you know, to fetishize and aestheticize gruesome things. You know, he makes this beautiful, gorgeous black and white film, which is just relentlessly appalling. And I can see almost no point to it, you know. And I think at least Radu Jude in Uppercase print, and it sounds like most of his other films, certainly in Afarim that I've seen, engages with really troubling, difficult aspects of Europe's history in a creative and interesting way. And for me, that is stimulating enough. You know, I don't need another kind of poetry in order to be engaged with it. And if the politics of this are sort of on the nose, I don't think in this sense it really bothered me, because I didn't feel like I was being hit over the head with it. I felt like I was just being told a story. I wasn't being told how to feel about that story. And I think that's what bothers me about heavy-handed politics, is when I feel like the artist is telling me how I should respond to it. And I didn't get that feeling here. So I think a lot of the things that really bothered you bothered me slightly less, but overall, it sounds like we both didn't particularly enjoy it.
Yeah. So I don't think I'd really recommend this film. I think definitely between the two, I would say watch the I Don't Care If We Go Down in History as Barbarians film rather than this one. But yeah, I wouldn't.
It's very good.
Yeah, cool. Okay, what are we watching next week?
Next week is Ham on Rye by Taylor Taormina.
Very good. Look forward to it.